right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the session, Look Out, the Future of Remote Site Governance. My name is Brian Mundy, and I'm the Senior Director of Product Strategy and Governance at WCG. And I support our study planning and site optimization division. But today, I'm your session chair. And just a few housekeeping notes. Please remember at the end of the session to complete your feedback forms. Don't forget to join us after the session in the hallway discussion to discuss today's presentation. And if you have any questions for our presenters, please use the Q&A and the chat functions in the Zoom meeting. I know they're really interested in getting the audience's questions and insights, so please feel free to use those throughout the presentation here today. I know for me, as a clinical trial technologist and a product manager, I try to fall in love with the problems that our industry faces, and especially, again, those where technology may provide solutions to reduce burdens. And I know we've all seen a shift to more remote work, from everyday meetings, conferences like this one, or even just the other day-to-day activities that we have. But we've also seen this lead to more remote oversight of our clinical trials. So I know I'm very excited to hear the perspectives of our presenters, Ken Lownie and Dr. Manasco, on the future of remote site governance. And with that, I'll just turn it over to Ken and let Ken take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. Brian and I had the, I think, good fortune, maybe not for him, to work together at a company some years ago. So it's really delightful to be reconnected and to making a new friend in Dr. Manasco. So I try to always start with good morning, Magi. We'll do movie references today. This is a really interesting session for me, remarkably interesting for a reason that's going to become clear as soon as I can make my slide change. There it is. I encountered the remote monitoring issue and problem relatively recently with the onset of COVID. And I developed a lot of thinking about it, and I'm going to take you through that in just a moment. And I kind of thought I had developed maybe a master's level knowledge. But then I met Dr. Manasco, and I realized I have an associate's degree in remote monitoring, and she has a PhD in remote monitoring. So it's a really interesting session to go beyond the conventional thinking about this topic, which I've been talking about for over a year, and to really dig deep. Dr. Manasco is just a remarkable set of things in one person. She is a physician. She's a real doctor, as they say. Sorry, any PhDs out there. She's a medical doctor, but she's also a scientist and works in the field of quality, clinical study quality, and has for 10 years. She's the CEO of a company called MANA RBM. And you can think of them almost like yes, they're a company, but also elements of a think tank, elements of a research organization. So they do clinical trials work at the cutting edge of best practices and next steps and future thinking. So while I've been thinking about this for about 18 months, she and her team have been working on it for the last 10 years, have published seminal papers, etc. So I'm putting myself today in a little bit of the moderator, a little bit in the student position, as you'll see as we go on. We're taking a different approach today. My goodness, aren't we all zoomed out and go to meeting out? So instead of just flipping slides, it's going to be a quarter of that and 3/4 of a podcast model. I listen to a lot of NPR, so if I had another career, it would probably be doing that. So I'm going to do my best to be an imitation NPR host. What are we talking about? So we're going to be talking about this whole remote thing, remote monitoring, remote quality, remote governance. And we're going to be trying to come at it from a few angles. So what's really going on? Where are we? What are people really doing? What are the challenges and opportunities? The opportunity part is really a big part of this. And lastly, in addition to those perspectives, there's a future look. What are the opportunities going forward? What can we do now that we couldn't do before? So kind of 3 angles to this. I'm distracted during the session. I see myself on this backlit blue screen, and the last thing I can afford to do is lose any more hair, and it keeps taking my hair away, Brian. Now I feel more like you. You knew I had to give you a little tease there. All right. So we're going to start with this. What's changing, has changed, is changing in regard to remote monitoring quality process, and how does this impact the sponsors and CROs and the sites? Actually, I shouldn't have left sites off of it. I'm going to start with that basic position. As I said, I've been talking about this for more than a year. So where we're at in the introduction of the COVID problem, meaning no one can travel, what do we do? Goes like this for me. I'm going to be talking about one particular organization for a few minutes. They're called Optos. Optos is a really cool company, retinal scanning equipment company, a device company over in Scotland. And here's how it goes. This comes back to me thinking I had a master's in remote stuff, and it turns out I have an associate. So Julia is our customer. She was using an Agatha product called Agatha TMF. Probably intuitive to you what that is. It's a product for storing trial master file documents in the cloud, a complete solution. It's a nice solution. Julia comes to us in about February, March, after COVID hit and said, no one can travel, how can you help? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, monitoring, we can't go anywhere. How do we do monitoring? And I talked to her, and Brian can relate as a product management type person. I collected user stories. What do you need it to do? And the user stories were simple. We can't go to look at documents. We can't go to check processes. We have to do it somehow remotely. And I, as a product person, put together those user stories and requirements and said, you know, this isn't that hard. We have the technology to put documents in secure spaces in the cloud. So take a copycat of the TMF, call it your investigator site file, and let each site have an ISF file in the cloud, secure its own separate special spot. Each site puts stuff up there. You as the sponsor or CRO can monitor by going in a back door there and doing QC checks on documents. And you can leave notes and pass them by. And I was really proud of myself. It's like problem solved, bing, bang, boom. We built something called Agatha Remote Monitoring. And for review, collection, review, QC of documents that comprise the TMF and the ISF, very nice solution. Optos, Julia is very happy with it. So first I'm going to tell you about that, and then we're going to blow it all away when I switch to Dr. Manasco. So Julia's perspective is, I had to write it down as 4 things. I talked to her about 2 hours ago in Scotland, and she said, tell them 4 things. Number 1, that the basic collection, sharing, QC of these shared documents is going well. It was a very large challenge to get site adoption, lots of obstacles because they perceive you're adding a burden to their work. Even when you're not, it's a change, so it's perceived as a burden. So she had to beg, trick, do anything she could to get them to adopt these changes, compromise. But when she did, she saw very significant benefits beyond just continuing to do traditional monitoring. The biggest one that she pointed out was improved quality control processes, QC checks, in that it's much more structured, it's organized, there's an audit trail of it, they have a record of the comments. It's not just yellow stickies posted on documents saying you're missing a signature. It's a complete workflow process that works to remediate those issues. So she's really happy with that improvement in process. I then asked her, so what happens after COVID and people can travel again? Does this all go away? And she said, absolutely not. That it will be a hybrid model, that there are reasons to go to sites, but not as many reasons as we used to go to sites for. So it will be a hybrid model. There's too much cost savings, frankly, not to incorporate more remote processes. And then the last thing I asked her is, so where do we go from here? I kind of knew the answer. This, I think, was one of her most important insights. She said, now that I have that infrastructure, that every site is connected to a repository in the cloud with full access control, I'm using it for other things. In Europe, there's a new requirement for post-clinical PCMF, feedback, some kind of feedback. I can see Dr. Manasco shaking your head. So PCMF, which means the sites after commercialization are asked to give feedback later, post-market. And they're using this infrastructure we built for monitoring to do that, because the sites all have a place to put information, upload documents, fill out forms, et cetera. So I found that really interesting, that, you know, once you have an infrastructure, you'll figure out what else to do with it. So that's the story of Optos. Very happy. It's beware of the burden, take advantage of the new QC capabilities and streamlining, and leverage the new infrastructure. And don't I sound happy? And it all worked out. And then I met Penelope. So this view I've been giving is very, very narrow of what is remote monitoring. And my focus has been on documents, the things in the TMF and the ISF. But I was ignoring the data side completely. That's pretty convenient of me since it's a huge part of it. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Manasco and let her talk now about the rest of the context of what I left out in solving these problems. And thank you again for coming, Dr. Manasco, and it's a real delight to work with you.
Thanks, Ken. Boy, I wish I'm going to record that intro and play it every time I have to give a talk, because that was a really very generous and delightful introduction. So thanks, Ken. What I wanted to talk to you first about is this idea of what are you defining as remote monitoring? And Ken and I ran into this ourselves, right? When we were talking about this, is that our definitions of remote monitoring were very different. Ken's was around document management, which is a component of remote monitoring, but we all think we know what we're talking about because we use common terms, but they are really very, very different. So what I want to do today is get you guys thinking about what is the way you're doing remote monitoring, and to really think about it in the context of good clinical practice. So we all know that in 2018, the FDA adopted ICH E6R2, the new definition of good clinical practice. And there were several components of that I think are really important. First of all, the FDA wanted us as an industry to do much more rapid review, that now that we have technology products like Ken talked about and many other ones, now we should be able to do review of subject data much faster. And they also released earlier, and also incorporated in here, is e-source guidance, electronic source, with the idea that what their hope is that as much of the data that you need for a trial that is actually collected de novo would be collected in the e-source system. And so therefore it would be able to be reviewed or evaluated in other ways. So first was the idea of us moving from not review every 6, 12, 24 weeks, but review every week, or even potentially every day, but clearly every week. The second thing is that they focused on this idea of risk-based. And I know you guys have all heard of that, but what I want to go back is what they meant by this is not raising risk, but focusing our efforts on those areas of risk. And I'll talk to you later about what we call our significant 6, because that's how we define those most important areas for risk. And but they include primarily, how are you going to show that the trial integrity, and how are you going to make sure that human subjects are protected? And they wanted to be sure that the protocol was followed. And one of the things that I've learned as I've supported companies who have gone through regulatory inspections is this is a big deal. So if you take home nothing from this talk, take this point home, is that it's not enough just to collect the analysis data. You really have to have some way that you're documenting and can monitor the process that you took to get to that data. And so let me just give you a quick example. We're going to talk about it. We're going to give you a little case study later. But the idea is, if your protocol says that your investigator who is completing your primary efficacy endpoint must be trained and must be an investigator, then monitoring is not enough just to say, oh, I checked those data fields. You now have to know, was that done, and what is the documentation to show that that person was trained and that person is an investigator. And I have seen the FDA censor patients where they could not meet this. So if you have overwhelming efficacy, not a problem. But if you don't, then losing 5, 10, 15 patients may make a big difference in whether you have a successful trial or not. So that's a really important point to take home from today. They also wanted to be sure, like I said, that human subjects were protected. We followed, laws and guidelines. But one of the other areas, and we'll come back to this, is they really wanted to understand whether the sponsors and CROs had recognized when there was a systematic error. And this is important because many of the monitoring approaches we'll talk about cannot identify that. So when they talk about quality tolerance limits, what they're talking about there is, at what point do you call this a systematic error, and what are you going to do about it? And that was the first question when I sat in, as I said, supporting a sponsor. The first question out of the inspector was, when did you recognize this was a systematic error? So these are the kinds of things I want you to think about. And so there are really three fundamental approaches that I think of as remote oversight, but remote risk-based oversight. So not the traditional just straight SCV, but the way that people have adopted this guidance that came out in 2018. And the first is what we call targeted SCV. If you go back a slide, targeted SCV, what people do is they do source data verification, but they're looking only at the data fields that are specific that have been defined as the critical data fields. But what you may be missing there is you may not have the process. And if you're going to do remote monitoring, you need to figure out, how are you going to monitor the processes that were taking place? Are you collecting that data in your CRF? Is it in your source record? How are you going to be able to check that? Because that's a key factor. And in targeted SCV, one of the things that we did, and we did a head-to-head comparison with this, was we recognized that systematic errors, the system just could not identify systematic errors. And that is a really important part. So one of the things that I want you to take home is, there are lots of ways to define remote monitoring. Make sure you know the way that you're defining it, and make sure you understand what the strengths and weaknesses of each one of these, because then you have to figure out a way to overcome those. So we talked about targeted SDV. Another way that's very common is the use of statistical outliers and key risk indicators. And with these, the companies that provide this, what they do is they look for outliers in a number of different categories. So they are sites that are not performing like everybody else. Sounds like it might work okay, but one of the problems is that if all the sites have a problem, you can't pick it up at all. There are actually many, many challenges with key risk indicators. One of the challenges is that when you get a signal, as they call it, so you find one site that's an outlier, your team still has to go and figure out, is this a real signal, or is this not, and that takes resources and it takes time. Another problem with this approach is that it takes you a long time to collect enough data before you can start to find those outliers. So you can have a lot of false positives. You can also have false negatives, and those are the ones that are going to give you a problem, right? Because a false negative means that your monitoring approach said there's not a problem, but there really is. And you find those with rare high impact errors, but you can also find them in instances such as, if you want to go back to 2009, Pfizer had a 483, I believe it was Pfizer, and it was around the team had done their dosing instructions wrong. So every single site didn't look different because the dosing errors were across all the sites. So you would miss those kinds of errors if you use the statistical outliers. And I will say, SDV didn't pick it up either. The monitors had gone out and reviewed multiple times because they used just the source worksheets, and it was the data managers that came back and actually found it. So one of the things to think about is monitoring is not just what the clinical monitor does. but it's what the data managers do to oversee the data. It's what the medical monitors do. It's what everybody does and can do remotely. And the final way, which we call science-driven oversight, is a different approach. And this approach says that you can define what the errors are that you need to look for. And if you can define those, then you can do analytics to identify those errors. And the benefit of this is it can be done from day one. It is protocol specific. So you're identifying those critical protocol errors and not just signals. And so this is the third approach. And as we said, we've got papers on, head-to-head comparison between SDV and science-driven oversight. We've got papers on key risk indicators. So I will not be at the hallway session, but Ken will take anybody's information and we'll be glad to send those papers to you. They're all in applied clinical trials. So you can also search my name and find them there. Okay, Ken.
I have a quick question back to you before we flip on this poll.
Sure.
Which is, there's three tactics described here. I assume, and you're probably going to cover this, so excuse me for pulling it out now, that it's not one or the other or the other. It's a mix and match depending on situation that you're in, that all of them have a role to play. Is that true?
No, I wouldn't say so. Actually, I think sometimes people do targeted SDV and statistical outliers, but I personally think that you don't need to do either of those other two if you do science-driven oversight. So that's the difference, because it's very protocol specific and very focused on these errors in these critical areas. So what I want you to do is think about what is the remote monitoring approach you want to use, and then be sure to you can fix any of these things as long as you have plans to do that. But one thing that people don't really talk a lot about is understanding where those strengths and weaknesses are, so that you can be prepared, your management team can be prepared, everybody's prepared for what they will miss using different approaches.
One of my big takeaways, and this has happened multiple times in my career, where I've realized that we slip into compliance versus actual quality, where we're doing what we have to do the way everyone does it. Brian and I have worked with validated systems for years, and validation methodologies for electronic systems, excuse me for saying, I don't think they ever have saved a life in the history of Earth. You have to do them and you have to comply, but you're not actually affecting quality. And it's not how real computer people improve quality of systems. So it's compliance, but it doesn't actually drive quality. And I think there's an element to this in some of the monitoring. We've been doing it the same way for so long, you lose sight of, well, why are we doing it? We're trying to do it to reduce errors and save lives. So I completely hear that in what you're saying. I think everyone can, go ahead, please.
Well, and we're going to get to it a little bit later, but that is the most important thing. So we've been doing it, and as we've gotten new technology, right, then we try to fit that new technology into our old methods. And these methods are deeply ingrained. They're ingrained in your purchasing, they're ingrained everywhere. But we have to shake that off and say, with the advent of new technology, it does allow us to do things we've never been able to do before. And we need to move as an industry, instead of being back where we were in the last century, we need to take, how can these technology systems actually help us to do a better job of quality oversight? So thank you, Ken. That's exactly what, that's one of my, I could talk forever about that.
The interesting thing is we all work in this industry, and we know people will call out regulatory concern as a reason they won't change. Well, I don't know if the FDA allows it, but I have found in this area, the FDA is leading, not a hindrance to the adoption of better quality processes. They're leaders and evangelists, which is remarkable and wonderful.
And I always give a plug for the Office of Good Clinical Practice at the FDA, because when I first started introducing the idea of electronic investigator site files more than 10 years ago, that was the question we got. And this was obviously before COVID, but what we found, you know, when we went through to it and we explained what we were doing to the FDA, they were awesome. And they confirmed that our approach, so that is a resource that we don't use enough. And it really, really is a help. So I highly recommend it. And I agree with you 100%, Ken. They're trying to push us now.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to do a very quick poll. If it works, our producer's name is Mark. Mark, can you put that poll up at this time? There it is. So I'm going to read it. That'll create enough time for people to go through it. Now that Dr. Manasco has gone through some of those different approaches, this is a set of choices for what you're doing now. There was a mistake made in this poll, so let me talk through it. The question is, what are you doing today in terms of remote monitoring? This was meant to be a multiple checkbox, not just one. So choose one, choose the most you're doing. Are you, I'll say, just doing what I said, just or not doing anything at all? Choice one, we're not doing any remote monitoring. Number two, we're just doing study documents, just the basics of Exchange study documents. Choice three, we're using targeted SDV model. Choice four, we're working with, as described, statistical outliers and KRIs. Choice five, we do science-driven oversight, all these driven remotely. Or choice six, it just doesn't apply to you, a different kind of company, or you're not involved in any of these things. So I'll give you one more second. Choice one, we're not doing anything. Choice six doesn't apply to you. And then choose the one that's the most you're doing from 2, 3, 4, and 5, since we can't do multiple choice. All right, let's assume that that's done. And I assume the way it works, Mark, is you can show us the results. My experience in the past.
That looks like, doesn't look right.
That's just the slide. So waiting for Mark to flash a screen. And Mark, you can come off mute if you want and tell us what's up. And I'm going to play the Jeopardy song now. Well, we're going to share those with you if they come up later. Nothing else to do. I will tell you what I find generally is that people aren't even sure, as Dr. Manasco said, people aren't even sure how to answer the question because, well, we get things sent to us by email. Is that remote monitoring? So there's many versions of this and you really have to have a deeper discussion. But I will say that everyone's doing something. Everyone's had to do something in the face of COVID. Now the question is, let's not do the minimum we have to do, but do better processes remote as was described. So now I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Manasco because there's the whole question of engaging in these remote quality processes, the transition into it, and how to make that work. If we're in one state, we want to go to another state. And I asked her to think about and talk about that transition into a new model, the planning and processes. Is that okay, Penny, if I turn it over to you?
Absolutely, that would be great. And you know, as we have tackled this and continue to try to refine these processes, you know, and I'll just kind of take you on our journey. And, you know, we started with that risk assessment coming out, I think probably the one out of Transcelerate, and it went on for pages. And it was like, how do we wrestle this to the ground? Yeah, we've done our likelihood of detection, our, you know, impact, and our ability to detect. But what we finally found is that again, if we go back to the FDA's guidance and said, let's focus on those areas that are the most important areas where if they are messed up, our study could be messed up.
And we have an interruption from the producer. Sorry, it popped up. So this is, you know, almost exactly what we would have thought, right? Look at the bars, how they go. Some people are not doing anything. A lot of people are doing something, 43% with documents, and then increasingly few when you get to more sophisticated aspects of the model. Exactly what I would have expected. I'm going to go ahead and close that if I'm allowed to.
And Ken, I think this shows exactly what we talked about. So when people think about remote monitoring, they've only been thinking about the document management, which is great. We really, really, really need that. And it's such a powerful tool, but there's much more. So that's where we're going to go now.
Right. Thanks.
Okay. So we took these, what we call the significant 6 areas, okay? And we figured out that if we got these right, then we were going to have a high quality study. So the first was human subjects protection. So how are we monitoring informed consents remotely? And this is one of the places that you can use your remote document management to do that. You can protect PHI. It's absolutely possible to do that. You can, and we could go into a lot of details on that later, but human subjects protection is really important. And informed consent errors is routinely one of the areas where in regulatory inspections, it's one of the top 5 areas, year in, year out, every year. So we're still not very good at it, but so that's number 1 in the significant 6. Number 2 is your primary and key secondary endpoints, okay? And the data associated with those. And remember now, this is not just the analysis data, but the process data. So how are you going to recognize this? And we published recently a paper. So if you look at the risk assessment, the place you can have the biggest effect and can take a risk score from 125 immediately down to 25 and probably lower is by your ability to detect the error. So one of the things that we want to do is think about, okay, we know that the primary endpoint is the most important thing. We need to go back to the protocol. We need to see how it's defined, and we need to figure out how can we prove that we did that. So sometimes that means collecting the field that tells you who did the assessment. Something simple like that. But the FDA, if your protocol says that the same person has to do the assessment all the way through, then you've got to show that the same person did the assessment all the way through. So these are the kinds of things that we know, but we haven't thought about as how to do remotely, and they can be done. The third is safety. Obviously, the actual safety data, reporting SAEs, recognizing SUSARs, so suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reactions. So I think it's one of the hardest ones to remember, but we need to recognize those right away, and you have a really short time to do that. Well, recognizing a SUSAR is not easy because not only do you have to recognize that it is related to study drug, it is serious, those are okay, but you also got to compare it with what's been reported before. But if you're a sponsor, what's been reported to the FDA before you can define it as a SUSAR. So thinking about all of those are important. The next one is IP management. And I think this is the one that gets the short shrift almost all the time. And yet at the end of the study, when you're doing database lock, this is the one that everybody has to go, oh, not just my compliance, but my drug accountability. And one of the things that we ran into for a study we were doing where we had remote, we had to do remote unblinded monitoring, and there was a complex process. 5 different organizations were involved, and we had to follow that process all the way through the unblinded preparation of the drug, the administration of the drug, the destruction of the drug, all of those aspects. And one of the things we found, is we found accountability problems in the past. We found problems with dosing. Did everybody get, not just did they get the drug, but did they get the entire dose? And so all of these things need to be thought about when you're thinking about IP management. The next is protocol compliance. And if you're thinking about trial integrity, a protocol deviation is by nature, in definition, means that you didn't follow the protocol. Somebody didn't follow the protocol. And so that, or some other study plan. But the idea is keeping track of those protocol deviations in real time is really helpful, because that is where you can often see these systematic errors when you start to look at the deviations. So, and then finally, and this is where Ken's discussion is, the GCP documentation. And that is a huge one, because if we don't document it, we didn't do it. And when inspectors or auditors come in, the first thing they do is look at your documentation. So that's what you need to, those are what we call the significant 6 areas. Brian, you popped up. So did you have a question?
No, I think we just lost Ken for a moment here. So we'll see if he's able to
Okay.
join back in. I think we just lost him.
Okay, well, then I'll go on just a little bit and talk about the quality plan. So after you've thought about and done your risk assessment for these significant 6 areas, then what you want to do is put together your plan for the study. So how are you going to monitor these? And they can be lots of different ways. You can use spreadsheets, you can use analytics, you can do it manually. You just need to have a plan for how you're going to do that oversight and figure out who's going to do it. Is it something the data managers are going to do? Is it something the clinical monitor is going to do? Are you going to use somebody that's a central monitor? That's another term that you'll hear. And they usually are often the ones that do at least the largest part of the remote monitoring. And then you want to think about how are you going to capture that information? So you've got your findings, and then your issues, and then your CAPAs. So how are you going to take that monitoring you've done and turn that into a way that you're going to use it for a true quality approach? And that's right, we can't show the slides because Ken has the slides.
Yep,
Actually, Brian.
I'm looking to bring them up right now so that at least I can.
Yeah, if there's, I think we can go to the case study there, and because I know that's the next on the list, and so I can walk through a worked example of exactly what we're talking about.
Oh, looks like Ken is coming right back online, so maybe we'll give him just a moment. Ken, are you back with us?
Well, that was exciting, Brian. I apologize. I'll reshare my screen and we'll pick it up from there. I apologize, everybody.
We're on the case study, Ken.
Got it. All right, I had to do believe it or not, a full reboot. So just a second.
I'm glad it's usually me that happens to.
Well, you know, if I had used a science-based quality approach, probably I would have avoided this very high risk item of losing connectivity and had a backup for it.
There you go.
My heat map was off.
But
No,
we
it's
all
probably-
have the ability to detect that. That's for sure.
Could be a little bit my fault, Ken. I should have told you to email me your presentation so I had a backup.
You know, it's all Mark's fault. Sorry, I'm kidding. Thank you for that. All right. Interestingly, just chatting while I do this, I actually had to come off site to do this because I have problems with network connectivity at home. So I'm spending $200 for a hotel room for about an hour and a half right now, thinking I would avoid that problem.
Well, be careful, Ken. People are going to talk about your hourly hotel visits. So,
Thanks for that. See, we got a little humorous interlude out of this. All right. Is that the
Yeah.
slide you would like?
there's one before it, I think.
Before it, you're right.
Yes. So if you're in oncology, you've probably heard of this. So this is an example from a primary endpoint, and I just want you to walk you through this. So it's called RESIST, and the version is 1.1, and this is the way for oncology studies for solid tumors, the industry defines whether those tumors grow or not. And there are a lot of requirements. So when somebody writes in a protocol, RESIST 1.1 will be used, the first thing you have to do from a monitoring standpoint is actually go in and look at all the requirements for that. So I'm just going to give you a few of them, but I'm going to talk to you about it. So from the subject standpoint, or if you want to think about it from whether you're using a central reader or not, one of the key aspects for determining when a patient progresses, so that's time to progression, they often call it, is that you have to, every 12 weeks, and I think it's always 12 weeks, but let's just say whatever the time point is, your imaging has to be every 12 weeks plus or minus a week. You can't go off that because that affects the statistician's ability to determine when that patient progressed. So when you talk about visit windows, this is a visit window that is like DEFCON 5 if you miss it, because you have to be able to do it in case that patient progressed at that time. So knowing that the imaging occurred at the right interval is really important. Another one is the same imaging modality must be used for every image. So if you use CT with contrast, you got to use CT all the way through. If you used MRI, you got to use MRI all the way through. And there's a lot of even more little mundane ones, which we're not going to go through. And many people will say, oh, I'm using a central reader, I don't have to worry about that. But what I'm going to tell you is you don't know. And just because somebody says we're going to do the central reading, you still need to make sure that they always measure the right lesion, because sometimes they don't. You must make sure that the same person reads all the images. If it is an investigator, you need to make sure, again, from a delegation, that they are called a delegation. And again, this part of this will be the way it's written in your protocol. And there's special handling for lymph nodes. So lymph node measurements are actually different than other tumors that you might have. So the question is, how can you monitor this remotely? And so what we did, again, using the science-driven oversight, is that we went ahead and we defined 137 errors that could occur. Sounds like a lot, but we went through it, and they're simple. Like, for each one of the visits, they were either too short a time frame or too long a time frame. The person didn't change, or the person changed that did the review. They used a different scan. All these things that we talked about. But once we could define those, then we could actually automatically identify when they occurred. And so that's the next slide. And what this does is it actually changes the monitor's role and the monitor's job. So if you can flip to the next one. Oh, I think Ken is frozen. So I'll talk through the next one. So in the next slide, what you'll see is, by using an analytical approach or the science-driven oversight, what we could do, there you go, is be able to tell the monitor, okay, you had there, again, didn't go through all the details, but there are target lesions and non-target lesions. And if they called them the wrong thing, those are all important. And by using this, we could tell the monitors exactly what the errors were that we were seeing in the data. And that way the monitor could immediately go in and work with the site to fix these errors. And then on top of that, we could also identify if a deviation occurred. So one is to get them fixed and find out if they're real errors or not. And if they are, we want them defined as a deviation. So the analytic tool can actually populate the deviation form so that you can keep track of how many deviations you're having. Are they going to be systematic? Are there things that we have to fix on either how we're doing training or whatever? So the idea is, when you use something like science-driven oversight, the power to do really complex cross-database, cross-data, analysis will allow you to find these errors that are almost impossible to find manually. And it allows the monitors to spend their time focusing on helping the sites to get those corrected. So again, a different approach and a different outcome, really, to monitoring.
Now everyone can probably tell why I felt I had attended a Passover Seder, and I met the wise child and realized I was the child who did not know enough to ask, or maybe the simple child, because this really broadened the whole thinking, not just beyond the documents into the data, and not just from a compliance model, but advanced risk-based models, but even to the specifics of things I would have never realized, which is that in a cancer study, that if the same person isn't taking the pictures at the same interval, it's not valid. And all this sounds very difficult and very expensive, but be a lot more expensive to have a successful treatment and have the FDA reject it because of process issues in the middle.
Exactly.
So I really took quite an education home from all of this. I'm going to turn the page for a minute. Hope that my connection holds. I'm going to talk about technologies, and the way we're going to do this one is take turns. So for a moment, I'm going to tell you what happened back last Marches when I worked with Julia from Optos, and I looked at it and said, are the technologies in place to support what she wanted to do? And I'll go through those technologies, and it was clear the answer was yes. Do we have a place where we can put documents in a very secure way in the cloud? Yes. Can we structure them with metadata and identifiers? Yes. Can we give each site a secure place for their documents, things that are theirs, like the informed consent forms, but still have a way for a monitor to come in and do a QC check on them? Yes. Can we move things from the ISF file to the TMF file once they're fully QC'd and they're appropriate to move? Yes. So I looked at all these things and said, I don't see any obstacles. So we had all those technologies. We didn't have a whole lot of people putting them together into a package. We call it Agatha Remote ISF. There's competitors out there, Florence is in this space and others, that have site-specific systems for managing the binder files, if you will. So I determined rapidly, yes, we can give a great solution for this to Julia. We launched a product and we did really well. And we have lots of customers using it now, and they're expanding the use, as I mentioned, to things like PTMF. But that's not the complete answer. That's not the ideal technology. That's a solution to a specific part of the problem that Julia had because she couldn't travel anymore, or they couldn't travel anymore. So I'm asking Dr. Manasco to now talk about what would a more ideal complete solution look like. And as I mentioned, remarkably, she's a doctor, a scientist, and a CEO. So MANA RBM has a solution set that includes getting closer to the ideal technology solution. Can you talk about what that ideal solution would look like?
Well, yeah, sure can. And, as I said, a key component of that is using an EISF and an eTMF, and we also have use, again, a vendor's learning management system. So what you're going to hear is we have taken pieces from lots of different vendors to give us what we need. So we have one suite around eTMF, EISF, and learning management. We have another one for eSource. We have, we work with sponsors' choices of systems too. So for instance, the IXRS systems for the study, this huge oncology study we were talking about, we actually had to work with 2 different IXRS systems and multiple different technology systems. And almost everybody has to do that, because even if you think you want an all-in-one platform, somebody is going to want some other component. And so the idea is that, you need to have something that can tie them all together. And for us, that's what we developed with this software Reacher, because it could take all of the data from all of these different systems and then could do the analytics across those systems. And the data didn't have to be in any special format. It could come in as an API or those dreaded trackers, but it could come in as any of these, because the analysis is not just the data, but actually study operations, like I said, safety, all of these different components. So you want to be able to have, I call it you want to have some way to tie it all together. I think that's the way to say it, whether we want to call it a platform or not, but you have to be able, because so many of these critical monitoring questions are really there across databases. If you're doing a genetic study, for instance, you've got to show, I don't mean a genetic study. I mean a study with a biologic, like a monoclonal antibody or vaccine. You have to actually do a pull and analyze antibodies. And if you don't, that's a requirement from the FDA. So if you're not doing that, you need to know that that's not being done. Either the samples aren't getting in, or they're not being drawn, or they're not being analyzed. There can be errors all the way along. But the first thing to do is think about how you want to do that. Do your study what systems you're going to use, and then how are you going to tie it together to monitor that. But don't start with the system. Start with what you want to do, and then pick the system.
The word integration is in a way a loaded term. You can tell by my white hair that I've been in IT for a long time. And 20 years ago, someone said, can these two systems be integrated? First, there's a wise guy answer, which is it's software, anything can be integrated. And then the answer better is, can it be done, this year with a reasonable budget? And the answer was often yes, but it would be incredibly fragile and system specific and be the cause of 90% of the problems with the system later. We're in a nice time in technology, in cloud-based SaaS systems. Some of you are technologists on the phone, and you probably know what a RESTful or REST API is. And as more and more systems have REST APIs and have the ability for another system to come in and act as a user query and get something out, you can picture systems like Dr. Manasco is talking about. You want a system that can go ask questions of all the other systems and give you a unified heat map view of these are the issues, these are the problems. So we are getting there. I had a last slide on this. We'll only give it for a second, if I can get it to advance. We were joking with each other as we got to know each other that I actually only have one hashtag in my whole life. I'm not a big Twitter user, but my one hashtag is kill all the platforms. And I mean it from a particular perspective, and it comes from a great cynicism from my years in software, which is people issuing RFPs, for example, going to market, say, but I want all these capabilities, all these functions, all these modules to be from one vendor, because A, it's simpler, and then they'll work together better. And here's the dirty little secret, I have to whisper. When a vendor has a very successful application and they're going to start offering more and more modules, they usually go buy them. And they're not particularly well integrated. They're smashed together into a pair of cobbler shoes, if you will. So that's the dirty little secret. Don't think because a bunch of capabilities are from one vendor that they're better integrated than two products well-designed using RESTful APIs to connect with each other, at least in today's market. This goes way back for me. I'm actually a Lotus alumni. And once upon a time, Lotus 123 was the spreadsheet of choice, but it lost a war to Microsoft, which had a suite. It was the best of breed versus a suite, Lotus 123 versus Microsoft Office. And it happens repeatedly in our industry that you get best of breed apps, and then they're packaged with other things, and it becomes a category like a CRM or whatever. So it's a very interesting history. And the answer isn't a best of breed is always better, but it's also not that a suite is always better from a single vendor. The answer, as you were just saying, Penelope, is that you need to do the analysis of what you're trying to do, look at those functions, look at that capabilities you need. And if it's going to be a series of applications that are best of breed, then you need to think through how are they going to work together to solve your problem, as opposed to a blind eye that says, I'm just buying the whole thing from Oracle. Sorry, Oracle. And I know they'll all work together because whether it's Oracle, OpenText, or someone else, that might not be the case. Sorry, OpenText. Brian, I'm getting in all kinds of trouble here. You need to rescue me. Anything you want to add to that, Penelope, from what I was just saying?
Well, I think you're right on target with that. And I guess the one thing I would say is that this may seem daunting to you. I will tell you, I didn't come from a software background. I am a physician, I am a scientist, but it is understandable. And the one thing I would tell you to focus on is, one, this is not where you necessarily go to your oldest company and say, we want your product, because oftentimes their technologies are actually really old, and you want to think about the reporting capabilities. So think about what you want to see, what you want to monitor, if you will, and how are you going to be able to do that? And that means you really have to look at the reports that the vendors offer. Think about things like metadata, because those can also help you to better define, missing documents and things like that. But remember, for instance, one very well-known company that does drug packaging and IXRS and all that, you know, the way that you can get all the data for every one of your sites is you have to download a report for every single site. They don't merge them together without spending extra money. So those are the kinds of things to look at when you're thinking about your vendor. But start first with what do you want to do, and then go from that to the vendor evaluation, and then how do you tie it together. And it doesn't have to be fancy and expensive. You can do some of this, especially for smaller trials. You can do it manually, or if you're doing bigger trials, then that's where you need the power. And I agree with you, Ken. Cloud-based software has really changed everything, and it has really helped us to make sure that we have better security and things like that by Amazon Web Services and things like that. So hopefully this has been a help to you, and that's all I have to say.
Well, you think that's all
no,
you have
not
to say.
quite.
We have a lightning round. So Brian, we're finishing with a lightning round. I go first, then 2 for Penny and 2 for me. So what I want you to take away, the shift to increasingly remote processes in this world is permanent. It's not going away, and get used to it. It'll be a hybrid model. It's not that we're not going to ever travel again. There'll still be free dinners, trust me. But overall, the hybrid model is here to stay. Too much money being saved by too many people. I saw a statistic once that 25% of the cost of clinical trials was in travel-related expenses. Isn't that remarkable? Because that's a lot of people traveling for a lot of time. Go ahead, Penny. You've got a couple to talk to.
Yeah, and I think as we talked about, with the shift not only comes risks and challenges, but opportunities, not only to rethink and drive improvements in quality, but I do want to give a plug to also a better lifestyle for a lot of people. You know, if you're not on the road all the time, you can be there for your kids' baseball games and recitals and dance. Well, maybe you don't want to be there for the dance recitals, but anyway, you can be there because of having this ability to do things remotely. So it is not only an opportunity to get better quality and also to do better oversight, because think about the traditional monitor is a monitor went out to the site, and if that monitor didn't do a good job, you didn't know. But with all of these technologies that give better visibility, now you can be very efficient in doing co-monitoring. Now you can be very efficient in doing an oversight that you couldn't do before. But you need to actually, so number 3 is transitioning requires deliberate shifts in study models and planning. So that's what we wanted you to think about, is go back and think about how you want to do it, and that will drive how you can transition. And in the end, you're going to get a much better outcome, and you'll kind of wonder why you ever didn't do it, why you ever did it the old way.
And I'll finish with just the points we were just making. These technologies exist today. Technology is not the obstacle right now to implementing remote processes and improving quality and risk-based monitoring through remote models. The technologies are there. Of course, they're evolving, but they're there. The 3 of us on the phone all work with these technology, on the meeting, Brian, myself, and Dr. Manasco. She has Reacher, Agatha has the solutions I mentioned, and Brian comes from a long history of working with technologies in this area. So they're out there. The level of integration always wants to be better, always wants to be more. People are now adding new capabilities as best of breed applications that have to be folded in. And it turns out we don't disagree. I think we're all good people, but we don't disagree much about platforms and applications. The only other thing I have to say is that as a father of both a girl and a boy, the dance recitals were tough, but watching your son strike out 3 times at 10 years old and crying afterwards, nothing breaks your heart like that. That was a hard one. But the dance recitals had a humorous side.
It did.
So Brian, thank you for your time. I'm turning it back to you.
Yes, and thank you, Dr.
Brian.
Manasco. Thank you, Ken, for this terrific discussion. And I hope that everybody will join us in the hallway discussion. The link for that was posted in the chat during the conversation here today. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to also complete your session feedback forms. But again, thank you to our presenters, and I hope everybody has a great day, and see you in the hallway.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Dr.
you.
Manasco. Bye, Mark.
Bye-bye.